Welcome to Psychoanalytic Perspectives on Racism in America. This series explores the enduring presence of racism and the psychoanalytic mechanisms that sustain it, drawing inspiration from key works and current research. Hosts Dr. Karyne Messina and Dr. Felecia Powell-Williams explore the complexities of racism through the lens of psychoanalysis as they foster a crucial dialogue on racial inequality. Here are your hosts.
Hello. Welcome to Psychoanalytic Perspectives on Racism in America, a special series on the New Books Network. I'm your host, Dr. Karyne Messina, along with our very enlightening co-host, Dr. Felecia Powell-Williams. In this series, we discuss how the tools and concepts of psychoanalysis might help us understand the persistence and dynamics of racism in the United States. Throughout the course of this series, we'll be talking to psychoanalysts, particularly Black psychoanalysts, about how to comprehend and combat racism. I hope you benefit from the material we cover in these podcasts. Today, we will specifically be talking about and illustrating how mechanisms of defense perpetuate racism in America. We will start our discussion today by talking about an article written by Dionne Powell, who participated in the 2000 documentary. This is an excellent documentary if people haven't watched it. It's Black Psychoanalysts Speak.
Yes.
It's wonderful. And I think you use it, Felecia, in some of the courses you teach, correct?
I have.
Yeah.
Correct.
The article we'll be focusing on, written by Dr. Powell, is Race, African Americans, and Psychoanalysis, Collective Silence in the Therapeutic Situation. And this ties in nicely with the discussion about psychoanalytic mechanisms of defense. There's one particular part of the article that I would like to start with, and then we can go from there. And this is a quote. "The collective silence of psychoanalysts on this societal reality limits our ability to explore, teach, and treat the effects, both interpersonal and interpsychic, of race, racism, and radicalized trauma, as well as implicit bias and privilege. This silence, which challenges our relevance as a profession, must be explored in the context of America's radicalized identity as the outgrowth of slavery and institutional racism. In other words, analytic work is stifled when white analysts hold on to color of their skin and consider it to be a privilege over otherness. This can persist and present an impasse and an obstacle to conducting our work, our analytic work, and our psychoanalytically oriented work. It is of interest to note that based on Dr. Powell's work, that radicalized trauma, especially as it pertains to African Americans, is seldom discussed in the psychoanalytic literature, with a few notable exceptions. And this article was written in 2018, yet it could have been written yesterday. This is very powerful, Felecia. What are your thoughts about this?
Well, first, Karyne, just thank you for the gracious introduction, as always. And it's just really a delight to be here with you for us to have these discussions. And, hopefully this will be a useful podcast for many as we explore this beautifully rich article from Dr. Dionne Powell. And your question, to me is my thoughts about this. And, even as we spoke about it, I resonated with that first part of the quote that you you read for us, I am really sitting with something that Dionne shared in this article when just, thinking about the collective silence. And the part, I'm going to read this because this is, again, it's so wonderful in what Dionne has written. I don't want to get any of this wrong. Dionne writes, our capacity to immerse ourselves in our patients' traumas is assisted by our ability to vicariously introspect and discover links with our own traumatic past. Now, in conjunction with the beginning of the quotes that you just read to us, I think that this piece is really important because she gives these wonderful examples with some of the cases that are presented in this article, but she gives it to us in a way for us to begin to think about ourselves. And I think about how much we tend to distance ourselves from our patients' traumas and our own. And in that distance, there isn't a collective. We're not there with them, so to speak. And that gets brought up early in this particular article of when the IPA conference in Prague. I think that oftentimes we're all holding our own traumas and we're holding them in this silence. And until we're able to begin to move in a direction and kind of break into this space, it allows us to then, begin to open up. But if not, if we stay in the silence, then it kind of leads to this place of stagnation. We're not moving. We're just in this space. And so I think that this particular quote is really important, that there needs to be this immersion so that we're able to begin to explore together. And sometimes that is stepping into something that we may have to explore for our own countertransference and begin to see where things are for us, because we hold things that we need to work through as well as whatever our patients are holding. But we have to be able to get there with them so that there is some ability to open up the space for dialogue.
That's so important. And it reminds me of something else in the article, and that is the race of the analyst and the analyst or patient. And I think that something that Dr. Powell said is really important. I'd like to read this. It's a short quote. It is safe to assume that most people of color will not be treated by somebody of their race, while white patients will. African Americans account for 12% of the 309 million citizens in the United States. Now, this is based on the 2010 census, but it covers over 3,000 members of the American Psychoanalytic Association, and only 7 in 1,000 are Black.
That's right.
So how do we deal with this? And it obviously makes a huge difference, but what do we do about it? And how can white therapists work with Black patients? It's not the same, but how can that be done? What do you think?
Thanks for that question. Is there more to that, Karyne, you want to add?
Well, there's more, but please. Please, there's a lot there.
Well, definitely, how do we begin to work with that is important. And I think that we are. I think that, a podcast like this, I think that much of the literature that's coming out now compared to when this article was printed in 2018, where there wasn't much. So there seems to be an expansion on beginning to think, on beginning to, open up the space where there, maybe there's less defense, or there is more of a willingness to put that out there for us to think about. So we have that ability to begin this. We've had this ability, let me say it that way, let me change that up, to begin this process, but there's still more work to do. It's easy for us to sit here in this podcast and be able to share this, but what I'm hoping is that people will understand that we have to begin to start from somewhere. We can't just say, well, let's wait for someone to do this or for someone to say something. But what happens if we say it? And what I tend to experience or come up against is, Felecia, I just don't want to say the wrong thing. I don't want to injure. I don't want to damage. And what we're dealing with there is really the projective identification of what many of us tend to carry. We carry injury, and we carry damage, and we carry pain, and we're so afraid that we're going to project, all of those things, that it's going to all spill out. So then that's where we come back to the collective silence, where everything stays silent. But what's really important right now is for us to look at the societal reality. Much of what Dr. Powell has written in this article, we got to look at this, because we are living in a time in which much of what's going to come into our consulting rooms will have a lot to do with what's the reality within our society. And so we have to be able to look at that and be able to sit with that with many of our patients. And oftentimes, those were things that were not really explored analytically. And it's coming in, and now we're having to look at that and to understand what's being carried and how we could begin to talk about it.
Absolutely. And I would say one thing that's so crucially important is that if one does make a mistake by saying the wrong thing, you have to talk about it. This is an aside, but a mother called me yesterday, and she was just devastated because her 4-year-old child went to a birthday party. Another 4-year-old's birthday party, or she might have been 5. And at the end of the party, this little girl had a wonderful time, but at the end, she went up to hug the birthday girl. And the birthday girl had been hugging lots of children, and she didn't want to hug this one. And she went home, and she had a terrible day, and she fell asleep. And while she was sleeping, the mother called me. And I said, well, I listened. I said, this is very sad. I'm sure she's deeply injured. But what you need to do when she wakes up, or if not tonight, tomorrow, is to talk with her about it. Don't let that just stay with her without words. It's so important. Words are so important.
That's right.
Talk to her about this experience, because otherwise it will be pushed aside in her mind. She might even, she might well forget about it, but it will be there, and it will be a source of shame, embarrassment, and another number of other possibilities. So if we make a mistake, we need to talk about it with our patients.
I think so, definitely. And even with the example that you're giving, it is an injury. There was something that this 4 or 5-year-old child was able to determine in a moment that she carried. And there was an injury. And so as you're sharing this way of intervening, you're saying to that parent, you have to let that be opened up, and there has to be discussion. There has to be a way of sitting with this together. And even with the parent being able to talk about what the experience is like, being there with their daughter or son, or exactly what is it that they experienced, because it wasn't just about her, but what did the mother think, and what did the mother feel? And so you're right. And thank you for sharing that with us, Karyne, because we see this so often in our consulting rooms where there's things that we question, should we say something about it? You know, whether we have a patient who's talking to us about what's happening in the workplace, what's talking to us about what's happening with family, with relationships. We see that. And I think, you know, we hear that often. And we see that also with many that come in with an interracial relationship, one that we're in right now, you and I, and what experience there. And oftentimes there's things that don't get talked about, and how the idea of time was considered unspoken and not discussed until Tony was able to talk about, you know, just some of the situations that he was up against just by getting to Beverly Hills, you know, having to be stopped. Yeah. And oftentimes those are things that will occur too with our patients, is that there's something that will come, you know, someone may say, you know, can you really understand my experience being a Black woman? Or can you really understand my experience being a white woman? Or not even racially, not even, you know, color, but it could be because someone assumes that we have a certain belief or a certain religion. And some of that is, I mean, there's so many historical pieces that are woven into that. We must be able to open up the space and talk about.
Absolutely. And that brings me back to something else that was in the article, and it doesn't take much to look into our history as Americans to discover the egregious treatment of America's Black population at the hands of white people.
Yes.
Say long, or you don't have to search too hard to find that. So instead of presenting a litany of the atrocities of the world,
yes,
it should suffice to examine this as a particularly egregious phenomenon. And the purpose seems to be to maintain a collective silence stratified along racial lines. We'll keep it to ourselves, you keep it to yourselves. Now, that reminds me of Philippe Copeland's idea about strategic denial that we talked about last time.
That's right.
Another way of thinking about strategic denial is to think about minimizing. Like, it's not a big deal. It used to be that way. It's not that way anymore. We all know that that's not true. But I don't see race as an issue here. It's one of the things I remember that Philippe said, this is not a racist country. I mean, I don't know how anybody could make that statement, but people do. Oh, or it was just a joke. No, there's nothing funny about any of it. So that was useful to me, that concept of strategic denial, which is conscious. It's not like denial in the sense of the mechanisms of defense that we usually talk about, which are unconscious, but this is pretty much out there, I think.
No, I completely agree with you. You know, I started to just kind of drift off myself and thought as you were sharing that in strategic denial, and that there will be these moments, oh, it's not that big of a deal, you know, it wasn't something I did intentionally. But, you know, I'm always up against with the pronunciation of my first name, Felecia. And I present Felecia. And oftentimes people will say Felecia. And it does seem quite interesting for me as we think about the strategic denial, how when I bring up, well, you know, my name is spelled this way and pronounced this way, that there does seem to be a lot of, oh, I didn't mean any harm. I didn't intend to injure or damage, as we talked about earlier. But there does seem to be a continuation of, pronouncing or spelling or misspelling, let me say it that way. And I've wondered, especially with some of our societal reality that we're in now, in the present time, the unwillingness, I will put it, and maybe you want to correct me here or have some comments about this, Karyne, to pronounce a name that has been presented time and time again, that this is a mispronunciation. And is there something about privilege that's woven into this, that, there's a privilege of not really seeing this as something important, that, I don't have to think about this. It doesn't have to be important as long as you're addressed. And so that takes me back to the comment you were making, about strategic denial. Is there something there that perhaps we need to really think about, even more deeply than what we have been?
Yes, I could really relate to that because of the spelling of my name, Karyne.
Yes.
People call me Karyne, Karyne, and there are various iterations of that. Now, that's okay. It's an unusual spelling. But people can also say, oh, the spelling of your name, I haven't seen it spelled that way before. How do you pronounce it? It's so interesting to me how I can even write. And I write something down, email to someone, and I say either sincerely or kind regards or regards, and I spell my name. And the next time I get something from them, they write Karyne, dear Karyne. So something's going on with that as well. So I definitely, yeah.
For sure. I think that's something for us to think about. In some of our discussions, there's been the question of, are people ready for change? And ready to begin to think about some of these isms that exist in a way in which there's room to, to explore and to think about it strategically, as written in this article, looking at literature, teaching, all of these learning pieces that are so important in psychoanalysis and even outside of it. Are people ready? And I wonder, are people ready? But, are people really willing to do the work? So I think they both go hand in hand. And I just loved how, as we were discussing that, it goes straight back to, as you mentioned, denial, and the whole fact that, but that puts a person, in this space, that could it be possibly this denying, of what's really there. And that means, are we willing to keep our eyes closed shut?
Yeah.
Or are we willing to walk in the societal reality with our eyes wide open so that we can begin to see and to begin to, start thinking about things that we can do together?
That reminds me of something else in the article. And I think this points to strategic denial. Dr. Powell talks about, well, I'll read a couple of sentences. Our silence clinicians reflects the shared history of slavery, its aftermath, and the effects, the traumatic effects of racism for all Americans. For a significant portion of our history, lynching was a socially acceptable, if not sanctioned, reality. whose purpose was to prevent the psychological emancipation of people of color. And I think from the pictures that we've seen in this article, we're not going to show here, but they're horrible pictures of people standing around as if they were at a 4th of July celebration and they were watching fireworks. It's just, and watching people hang and die from the limbs of trees. It's just, it wasn't all that long ago, and it was horrific.
Karyne, you brought up earlier with a patient and her daughter. And as you're bringing this up as, this big social event, almost like a 4th of July celebration, what we do know about 4th of July celebrations is that it's usually geared towards family, and that there's children, adults, adolescents, everyone is there, usually for some type of celebratory occasion. There's usually laughter and joy. It's supposed to be a fun event. And you're right. It did appear quite like what you're describing, to where there was, families gathered around and smiling and pointing to these horrific images, these bodies that had been tormented, disfigured, that were hanging from trees, chained to trees, pulled apart, and almost as if not thinking of how the actions that have been taken really affects other people. Not necessarily considering, at least in my mind, seeing those individuals as human beings, but as a way to threaten and frighten and make sure that there was a message of this power, and also silence.
Absolutely.
And so, I bring that because that was very painful to watch, that it seemed to be like a Friday or Saturday night family event.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I say there aren't lynchings. There are lynchings in the world that continue, which is horrific. In the United States, if it happens, it's not publicized. But there's still a lot of dead Black bodies that we see. For example, Michael Brown, George Floyd. They died horrible deaths. So we could say, oh, that doesn't happen anymore, going back to strategic denial. But it does happen. The form may be different, but it does happen still.
And I'll disagree a little bit with what you're saying in regards to we don't get to see it, but we watched George Floyd's lynching. There was footage of that.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, for several minutes we watched it.
Yeah. And tree. I guess maybe that was the difference.
Yes, I definitely agree with you. But I mean, just the sheer, gosh, I sit with the word, the audacity that one could, take the life of another person in front of so many who were watching. And, we see that. We see that every day, sometimes on the news, that lives are taken. And, how do we begin to process that? And then going back to that quote that you read from Dr. Powell earlier, the importance for us to be able to talk about these things within the consulting room and to be able to look at what comes in, and what shame and guilt does someone hold, and imagine that, their analyst of color or therapist of color or patient of color may have a certain thought or idea about what might be going on in the mind of the other, or what beliefs they may have. And then how much of that tends to become silenced in the room. And we must begin to think about that, as a professional body. How do we begin to open that up? We open that up by talking with each other, by telling our own stories, with each other. Our stories are powerful and they're rich and they're useful, but being able to get comfortable with each other so that we can learn and be able to gather, tools that could be helpful to others to learn, and being able to speak what might be coming up in the transference and even in our own countertransference in that consulting room with our patients. That's so important.
Absolutely. It's everywhere.
Yes.
When I look at some of the pictures of the lynchings, I wonder if it's strategic denial, neglect, which we talked about last time too, as a mechanism of defense, in that something's happening, but you don't do anything about it. Or is it identification, or is it sadism? I'm not sure, but I think it's an important question.
It's a very important question, and it does leave it open for us to explore, what could it be? But we know that oftentimes, and Dr. Powell validated this also in the article, that when that silence is left, to where there, or a better way to put it, when the silence is not addressed, it can cause even more tension, even more discord in what the patient might be experiencing, but even also within, the dyad between the patient and the therapist or analyst as well. And so it really is important for us to think about that, to think about our own traumas, because this does become very, very important for us to address the intergenerational traumas within our society and even within our own being that may cause us to deny what's there, but also neglect what's there.
Absolutely. It's sad. Sad is what came to my mind. It's hard to believe, but it's also very sad.
What comes to mind for you when you think of sadness? It being sad.
Injustice.
Yeah.
And the horrific treatment. I've since I have looked at the pictures of the article and also other pictures of lynchings lately. It's traumatizing. It's hard to believe that people celebrated these things, but it's just very difficult. I think trauma is a good word. It is traumatizing.
It is. It's hard to believe that people celebrated those things, but it's hard to believe that they're still celebrated now. And one word that we haven't brought up is the word fear. That it does scare people. The fear that's there. And what happens when we're afraid of what's in the room with us. And that keeps us silent.
Right. So that's why it's important to dive into the pool of discussion.
Oh, I love that, Karyne. Yes.
Yeah, that's why, particularly at this time in the United States, this election cycle, we have to talk about these things. We have to talk about denial. We have to talk about racism, strategic and that which isn't conscious. Because if we don't, this divided nation will stay divided and probably get a lot worse.
Yeah. That's right. That's right. That is really important.
I actually just wrote something on the election, and I think that these next, I believe it's 65 days, are going to be, I hope they're enlightening, but I don't think they're going to just be enlightening. I think there's going to be a lot of acrimony and a lot of accusations, and I think it's going to be hard to tolerate, but yet we need to tolerate it, and we need to participate. That was the message of this book: is we need to participate. We need to talk to neighbors. We need to form groups. We need to vote. We need to help other people get to the polls, to register, and then get to the polls to vote.
Yes, I definitely agree with you. And also, how might that be perceived in our work with our patients? And for us to understand that there will probably be a lot of experiences that we may hear. And can we be bold enough? Can we be there with and courageous enough to be able to explore what we are hearing to help them to help our patients to begin to understand perhaps what it is that they're holding.
And what we're holding.
You're right.
That's right. It's true.
Yes.
To feel and to listen at the same time.
That's it.
I believe that it's wonderful that we have a Black woman, a part Asian woman who's a candidate for president.
A woman.
A woman. That's a wonderful. So that in and of itself is terrific, but it's not enough that we just have this candidate.
But you're looking at diversity here. You're looking at gender, you're looking at race, you're looking at culture. And what might that mean to the patient that comes into the room? We know what it might mean, or we will discover all of what it might mean to us. But once it comes into, our offices and with the work that we're doing with our patients, being able to hear some of those things that can create much of the denial that we've talked about today, the neglect that may be presented, but also the fears and the worries, and how will that be perceived and acted out in that analytic process. And so to be able also, when you talked about, how do we address this as analysts, as therapists, sometimes when there is stagnation, when it does get hard, to be able to consult with those who will be able to hear things that perhaps we don't hear. And consultation is a useful tool, for many. And so we have to be able to think about that, because we can't carry everything alone. And it's just nice to be able to have those conversations and explore what's there.
Well, for example, this consultation we have with each other, so to speak.
Yes.
I mean, For me, it's wonderful.
Oh, yes, definitely. Oh, yes. I agree with you.
Well, I hope this has been helpful to people and has been very helpful to me. And we'll be back next month with another podcast in the series Psychoanalytic Perspectives on Racism in America.